Montana Territory. 1881, the wind howled across the empty plains as dusk rolled in, dragging a bitter chill behind it, and when Declan Tate stepped into his barn, lantern raised, he did not expect to find a stranger curled up in the hay, fast asleep. He froze. A woman young, maybe in her early 20s, was nestled into the far corner, half wrapped in an old horse blanket, her boots kicked off, her brown hair tangled from the wind. She had not come through the front. Declan stepped quiet, the lantern lighting her face. Dirt smudged her cheek. Her hands were red with cold. She looked like she had not eaten in days. She stirred, blinked against the light, then sat up fast. "Do not scream," he said, holding the lantern low. "I am not going to hurt you." Her eyes darted around like a trapped animal. She grabbed her boots and stood, though she swayed a little doing it. "I will go," she said, voice sharp with fear. "I did not take anything." Declan saw the outline of a bruise on her jaw, faded but still ugly. "You are not in trouble." "But it is 17 degrees out there, and I got no plans to find a body frozen in my barn tomorrow morning. I do not need help. You are barefoot in the hay." She looked down, then sat again without a word. Her shoulders shook once, and she turned her face away, trying to hide it. Declan set the lantern on a beam, took off his coat, and walked it over to her. She did not take it. "Name's Declan Tate. I own this ranch." He crouched beside her, not too close. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Juliet," she said softly. "Juliet Darnell," he nodded. "You hungry?" Juliet's lips parted like she might lie, then she just nodded. He stood. "I will make you something. You can eat by the stove, and when you are warm, we will talk." She looked up at him, eyes narrowed, like she did not understand why he was being kind. Declan walked out without pressing her further. By the time she stepped into the house, her boots were on, her chin lifted like she was trying not to show how bad she was hurting. But she stopped cold when the warmth hit her face. She did not say anything as he ladled stew into a bowl and slid it across the table. Declan poured coffee. "You can sleep here tonight. Spare room. Tomorrow we will see what needs doing. I will not be a burden." He looked at her steady. "I did not ask if you would." Juliet ate like she had not had a real meal in days. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and stared at the fire. Declan leaned back in the chair, fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. "You running from something?" She flinched, then nodded. "I have seen worse," he said. Juliet's voice dropped. "My father arranged a marriage. He said it was the only way, but the man was not right. He drank. He hit. I tried to leave once. Got dragged back, so I waited until he was gone to town." She stared into the fire. "I walked 3 nights straight, slept in a ditch the first night, barns after that." Declan stayed quiet. "You will not send me back?" "No." She looked at him then like she was not sure he meant it. But he did. "You ever worked a ranch?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well," he said, "you do not have to, but if you want to stay longer than the night, I could use help in the garden come spring. That way it is fair." "I will work," she said quickly. "I can sew too and cook." He smiled just a little. "Then you are welcome here." That night she slept in a real bed, and Declan checked the door twice before turning in just to be sure she would feel safe. Juliet stayed. She never asked for pity. She chopped firewood with him, fed the chickens, scrubbed the pans without complaint. And though she did not say much at first, her eyes started to soften when they met his. Weeks passed. By the second month, Declan knew what her footsteps sounded like on the stairs. She laughed once when he dropped a sack of flour and turned the whole kitchen white. It was the first time he heard her laugh, and it made something twist in his chest. One morning, while she was mending his shirt by the window, he brought her a mug of coffee, sat across from her, and asked, "You ever think about what comes next?" Juliet paused. "I do not know what I am allowed to want." "You are allowed to want anything." She looked at him, her eyes warm but guarded. "I want peace," she said. "I want to feel safe when the sun goes down. I want to sleep without listening for boots outside the door." Declan nodded. "You got that here." Juliet's fingers curled around her needles slower now. "You are different," he smiled faintly. "How so?" "You never ask for anything, not even kindness back." "I do not offer it to get something." She set the shirt down, voice quiet. "You already gave me more than anyone ever has." Declan looked at her, and for a moment it was like the room got still. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and the way she looked at him, it was not fear anymore. It was hope. Then came spring. They worked side by side in the earth, planting potatoes and carrots, and Juliet smiled more. She sang under her breath sometimes. Declan caught himself watching her hands move. How gentle they were, even after all she had been through. One afternoon, rain rolled in fast. Declan grabbed her hand and they ran for the barn, both soaked by the time they got there. Juliet stood beneath the loft, wet hair clinging to her face, her eyes shining. Declan's voice was quiet. "You are not that woman in the hay anymore." She stepped closer. "You are not just some cowboy anymore either." He brushed rain from her cheek. "I think about you all the time." Juliet reached up, fingers touching his chest. "I do not want to be afraid to love someone." "You do not have to be." And when he kissed her, it was slow and steady, like two people who had been waiting their whole lives to be safe enough to fall. She wrapped her arms around him, held him like she meant it. Declan whispered, "You got a future here, Juliet, if you want it." She nodded against his chest. "I do, with you." And outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that barn, she was not running anymore. The thaw came slow that year, with snow clinging to the north-facing slopes well into April. The horses shed their winter coats in clumps, and the creek behind the house swelled, fed by meltwater rolling down from the hills. Mornings were still cold enough to bite, but the air carried the scent of wet soil and sap rising through the cottonwoods. Juliet took to rising early before the rooster called, to knead bread in the quiet kitchen. Declan would come in from the barn with his hands chilled and his collar damp, and she'd already have the coffee boiled and the dough rising under a clean cloth. They didn't speak much in the mornings. They didn't need to. The silence between them had grown easy. One afternoon, she brought him a tin of nails while he was repairing the fencing along the southern pasture. He looked up from his crouch and brushed dust from his knees. "You didn't have to walk all the way out here," he said. "I wanted to," she replied, handing him the tin. "You missed lunch." "Figured," he said, glancing toward the sun. "Been losing time out here." She leaned against the post beside him and watched the wind ripple through the grass. Below the ridge, two calves nursed beside their mothers. "Do you ever go into town?" she asked. He drove the nail in slow before answering. "Only when I have to, supplies, feed, sometimes to send a wire." "Do folks know you out there?" He tapped the hammer against the wood, thinking, "Some do, not well." "I keep to myself." Juliet glanced at her boots, then back at the fence line. "You mind if I come next time?" He looked at her, not surprised exactly, but measuring. "You ready for that?" "I think I need to be." Declan nodded once. "We'll go Thursday." The general store smelled of dry tobacco and pine soap. Juliet kept close to his side, her shawl drawn tight, and watched each stranger like they might speak her name. But no one looked at her twice. The shopkeeper greeted Declan with a nod, rang up the flour and sugar without fuss. Juliet paid for a length of muslin with coins she'd earned mending the neighbors' shirts. On the way back, they rode quiet in the wagon, the wheels rattling over ruts. A hawk circled high above the cottonwoods, its cry thin on the wind. "I thought it would feel different," she said. "How so?" "Like they'd know. Like someone would see me and drag me back." He didn't answer right away. Then, "That man you ran from, he doesn't have reach here. And even if he did, he'd have to get through me." Juliet turned her face toward the wind, her hands fisted in her lap. "I believe you." That evening, Declan set a small wooden box on the table. He'd carved it himself, smoothed the edges with care. Inside were folded packets of seeds, beans, squash, tobacco flour, and one small envelope marked with her name, containing poppy seeds. Juliet touched the envelope gently. "For the garden, for you," he said. "You said you wanted peace. Flowers help." She blinked slow. "You listen close." "I try to." In the weeks that followed, she cleared a plot near the back stoop, digging rows with her hands and planting each seed with quiet intention. She didn't sing while she worked. She didn't hum, but her shoulders loosened and her mouth softened in the corners. One evening, after supper, she found him polishing tack beside the barn. The sun was low, painting the hills in gold. "You ever think about what kind of life you want?" she asked, settling beside him on the bench. "I suppose I already got most of it," he said. "Land that's mine. Work that keeps me upright, quiet when I need it." She rested her hands in her lap. "And the rest?" He looked at her then, not with longing, but something steadier. "Someone to share it with, someone who wants it the same way." Juliet nodded once, eyes on the worn leather bridle in his hands. "I think I do." He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but she felt it all the same, the shift between them, quiet and sure. Later that night she stood in the doorway, the wind tugging at the curtains, her arms wrapped around herself. Declan crossed the room and stood behind her. "You all right?" "Yes," she breathed. Sometimes I forget I'm allowed to be." He reached out slowly, resting a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. "You're allowed," he said quietly. And she leaned back against him, letting the weight of her body settle into his, like a tree learning how to root again after a long winter. By early May, the cottonwoods unfurled their leaves and the fields turned thick with green. The creek behind the house ran clearer now, its surface speckled with gnats and the occasional dart of a swallow. Juliet kept her apron tucked with wild chamomile and dried mint, and every evening she steeped a bit in hot water, handing Declan a tin cup as they sat on the porch. One night, after the sun dipped behind the hills, she leaned into the porch rail and said, "I'd like to send a letter to someone back in Kansas." Declan shifted in his chair, watching her face. "Someone who helped you," she nodded. "A widow named Mrs. Larkin. She let me mend for her in the evenings when my father thought I was at the parish. She gave me the map that got me here." He tipped his head. "You want to let her know you're safe." Juliet folded her hands. "And that I'm not going back." Declan stood and opened the screen door. "We'll ride into town tomorrow." Inside, she dipped pen in ink, the paper trembling just a little beneath her hand. She didn't ask Declan to read it when she finished. She folded it small, sealed it with wax, and handed it over without a word. He tucked it into his coat pocket and didn't ask questions. That same week, the neighbor's boy broke his leg after falling from a mule. Declan hitched the wagon without waiting to be asked and drove the boy's family to the physician 20 miles east. He was gone 3 nights. Juliet kept the fire going, fed the stock without complaint, and when he returned, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, she met him at the gate. "You ought to sit," she said, already reaching for the reins. "I'll unhitch." He caught her wrist gently. "You did all right. I kept the place standing," he nodded. "That's more than all right." The next morning, while she washed bedsheets in the creek, Juliet paused and looked up toward the ridge. A deer stood watching her, still as stone. She didn't move. There was a calm to the moment, a hush she hadn't known she'd craved. When the deer turned and vanished into the timber, she smiled to herself and wrung out the last sheet. Later that week, they were invited to supper by the Halberts, an older couple who lived 2 miles west. Declan hesitated when Juliet asked if they ought to go. "I don't know that you're ready for talk," he said. "I think I am." She wore a dress she'd sewn from leftover fabric, plain blue cotton, neat at the seams. Declan pulled on his better jacket, and together they rode out just before dusk. The Halberts greeted them kindly enough, but it was Mrs. Halbert's eyes that lingered a moment too long. "You're the girl he took in," she said, passing a bowl of beans. "From Kansas?" Juliet met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Halbert glanced at her husband, then back. "Must have had a hard time of it out there." Juliet didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am, but I'm not what happened to me." Declan's hand brushed hers under the table just a touch, brief and grounding, and Mrs. Halbert, to her credit, looked down with a small nod. "Well, you've got good hands now." That night, once the horses were stabled and the lantern was trimmed in the kitchen, Juliet said, "I didn't expect kindness from strangers." "You didn't take anything that wasn't freely given," Declan said. "That counts for a lot." She looked at him, quiet for a moment. "Do you think we'll always be like this? You and me, working and talking and living this way?" He considered her, then answered soft. "Only if you want it." "I do," she said. "But I'd like something more." He stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots. "Tell me." She reached up, fingers brushing the edge of his collar. "I want a life where I don't have to ask if I belong." Declan's voice was steady. "Then stop asking." She leaned into him, her cheek against his chest. "I think I stopped the day I planted poppies." He rested his chin on her hair. "Then we'll build from there." Outside, the stars blinked through the dark like scattered embers, and the house stood warm behind them, its windows glowing like a promise kept. By June, the garden gave up its first offering, spinach leaves soft as silk, radishes sharp and red beneath the dirt. Juliet rose with the sun, pressing her palm to the window before dressing, her breath fogging the glass only faintly in the early warmth. She kept a tin journal now, the kind with blank pages sewn tight along the spine. She didn't write much, mostly dates and weather, but sometimes she pressed a flower between the leaves and stared at it until she remembered how it had looked growing wild. Declan had begun clearing the north pasture, where the ground turned stony and wild thistle ran thick. He'd swing the axe through deadfall while the dog he'd taken in last winter trotted through the brush behind him. Juliet brought water in a canvas sling and sometimes sat on a stump nearby, pulling thread through linen. She didn't speak unless he did. One evening, after she'd packed away dried lavender into cloth sachets, she found the barn empty but for the mare. The saddle was still warm. She followed the trail through the back scrub, not hurried, just curious. When she reached the ridge, Declan was standing near the fence he'd built last spring, his hat in his hand and his eyes cast toward the far valley. He turned when he heard her boots in the grass. "Didn't mean to be gone long." "I wasn't looking to interrupt," she said. He tilted his chin toward the horizon. "There's a man buried down at the bend. Fellow who owned this land before me. Died during a blizzard trying to save a calf. I figure nobody remembers his name but me." Juliet stepped beside him. "What made you come out here tonight?" "I don't know," he said after a while. "Sometimes it feels like I owe it to the ones who never got to finish their lives." She turned her gaze to the sky where a hawk circled wide over the treetops. "I think about that too. About the people who never got to grow into who they might have been." Declan's voice was low. "You think you'll grow different here?" "I already have," she said. "But I don't know what comes next." He looked at her fully then, his face open in the fading light. "We could build something more permanent, if you wanted." "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to consider that," she said. "But I want to." They walked back through the tall grass without touching, but when they reached the barn, he reached out and brushed a stray leaf from her hair. She looked up at him, not smiling, just steady and sure, and for the first time her hand found his without hesitation. Later that week, A letter came from Kansas, carried in on the stage. Declan handed it to her without a word, and Juliet took it to the porch, sat beneath the shade, and read it once through. When she folded it, her face was unreadable. "Mrs. Larkin says the man I ran from left town 4 months ago," she said finally. "She doesn't know where he went." Declan studied her. "Does that change anything for you?" "It settles something," she said. "Not everything, but enough." He nodded, then leaned back in his chair. "You ever think about marrying again?" Juliet didn't answer right away. Then, "I didn't the first time, not really. It was something done to me, I know. But this life now, it feels like mine to shape." Declan watched the wind lift the edge of her sleeve, the way her fingers rested firm against the wood rail. "Then shape it how you need." She glanced over at him. "Would you want it to include you?" "I already hoped it would." The screen door creaked open behind them as the evening settled in, and she stood, slow and even. "Then let's start with planting more beans," she said. "We'll need more if we're planning for 2. He rose as well, and they walked into the dusk side by side, their feet falling into step without effort. The world was quiet around them and nothing rushed. There was no need. In the weeks that followed, Juliet stitched curtains from scrap muslin, and Declan carved handles for the kitchen drawers. They didn't speak of futures in grand terms. They just built them, one quiet day at a time. The poppies bloomed in early July, bright and open, and she let them be. Untamed and whole, July deepened, and the heat rolled in steady. The air thickened by midday, and even the hens moved slower beneath the coop's shade. Juliet rose earlier now, before the sun caught the roof, and set her hands to the work without waiting to be asked, shelling peas, boiling linens, stitching a quilt from worn shirts and leftover ticking. There was comfort in the rhythm of it, in the hum of the house as it shaped itself around her. Declan had taken to repairing the smokehouse, replacing the warped planks and oiling the hinges. He said little about it, but she noticed the way he worked longer hours, how he kept glancing toward the small grove at the back of the property as if measuring something in his mind. One afternoon, while she swept out the porch, he stepped up from the pasture and leaned against the post, his face streaked with dust. "I was thinking," he said, "about building a new loft above the kitchen, something better suited for sleeping. Cooler in summer, warmer when the snow comes." She paused, the broom bristles resting against the plank floor. "For guests, for us," he said, "if you'd like to stay here proper." She set the broom aside and came to stand beside him. "I already do," he met her eyes. "Then maybe we ought to make it official." Juliet didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, tracing the calluses with her thumb. "I want vows that aren't hollow," she said. "Not spoken quick or written by someone who never knew me. I want something that fits us." Declan nodded once. "Then we'll say them our own way." They rose before dawn 2 days later, walking out past the barn with a coil of twine and a small tin box. At the edge of the cottonwood grove, Declan cleared a patch of earth where the grass grew soft and wild. He laid down 2 smooth stones he'd gathered from the creek, flat and round, side by side. Juliet opened the tin, revealing 2 narrow strips of linen she'd embroidered with thread dyed from walnut husk. One bore the shape of a poppy, the other a pine bough. She handed him hers. "Tie it around my wrist." He did, careful not to pull too tight. Then she tied his. "I vow to stay when days are lean," she said softly, "to keep the fire lit when the night grows long." He lowered his voice to match hers. "I vow to carry what burdens I can and step aside when you need to walk alone." "I'll choose you again," she said, "every morning." "I'll build you a life worth staying for," he said. They stood for a long moment, still beneath the trees, the morning light spilling gold across the grass. No one else bore witness, and none was needed. Afterward, they walked back slow, hands clasped. Juliet didn't let go even when the kitchen door creaked open and the scent of ash and morning coffee greeted them. By August, the new loft was complete. Declan carved a ladder from stripped pine, sanding the edges smooth so Juliet's palms wouldn't splinter. She lined the narrow window with dried herbs, and each evening they climbed up and lay side by side, listening to crickets and the low murmur of wind in the eaves. One night, as he pulled the quilt over them, she turned toward him and said, "I used to think safety meant silence, no questions, no eyes on me." Declan brushed her hair back from her brow. "What does it mean now, being seen and still being safe?" He kissed her temple. "Then you've got it," she smiled, not wide but full. "Then I'm home." That winter, they smoked venison and stored apples in the root cellar. They hosted the Halberts once, serving stew thick with barley and wild onion. Juliet wore a simple wool dress she'd dyed herself, and when Mrs. Halbert asked after the wristbands, Juliet held hers up and said, "We made our promises with our hands, not paper." Mrs. Halbert only nodded and said, "Seems to be holding just fine." The land held too. Snow came late, but when it did, it blanketed the roof in soft silence. Declan mended harnesses by lamplight while Juliet read aloud from a borrowed book. They talked of adding a henhouse come spring and maybe one day a child, but there was no rush. They had time now. When the first thaw came in March, Juliet stood barefoot in the patch of tilled earth near the porch, pressing her heel into the cold soil. The poppies would return soon. She could feel them waiting beneath the frost. Declan called from the barn, and she turned toward the sound, her hands tucked behind her back, her smile quiet and certain. She belonged. He was waiting. And the life they had built carefully, honestly, without hurry was not something they'd stumbled into, but something they had chosen and would keep choosing every day that followed.